I've been reading you for years, and I think it's been an interesting experience on the left, like over this past decade, let's call it. I remember being very, very hopeful in certain moments and feeling very, very bleak in others. And I just sort of wanted to ask, like, before I maybe ask you a little bit about the left, I want to ask, like, okay, so we're seeing all these things, and the big story is capitalism, right? But have we experienced any kind of like market change in where the fights must be, right? Because I remember like when we were all sort of, coming up, it was austerity was like the big thing, right? Like, can the state act? Will the state act? And now, again, like as we were saying, like it seems like that's less of the focus, but the inequality is still there. So I'm just curious, like have things like changed in any kind of real way? Is there a new direction that we need to be focusing on in terms of like taking on this beast?
Things have changed massively, and in some ways, things have stayed the same. And we were just doing things wrong the first time around. So, I think one of the reasons I wrote this book was in response to the movement that, I kind of grew up in. I'm sure you guys all did as well, where the focus was, particularly here in the UK and Europe, against austerity, fighting austerity. And there was a very clear reason for that. It was making people's lives dramatically worse and continues to do so, and has kind of screwed over our economy, particularly here in the UK. But it was put in place because it benefited those at the top, and it did so for a number of different reasons. Firstly, because it kind of disempowered workers at a time when you were seeing a real pushback against the kind of extractivist model that we had. So, it made it harder for people to organize in their workplaces. It made it harder to do various other forms of organizing. It just made it harder to survive. And in doing so, kind of disempowered people. And it also kind of facilitated profit making in a number of different sectors. So like, where governments cut public spending, powerful private corporations emerged to take on government contracts and then like skim a bunch of money on the top. So there were kind of very like obvious instrumental reasons why these policies were implemented that were about class power. But we didn't really talk about that. Instead, we were just like, the government is nice and will do good things for you, and we don't have enough government, right? And this isn't just a recent thing. This goes all the way back to the kind of Keynesian tradition that emerged around like the 1930s and was responsible for the kind of like sustainable capitalism we had in the wake of the Second World War. This was a time when workers were much better organized, and economists like Keynes had come up with this new way of understanding the economy in which there was much more of a focus on demand. So, if you cut government spending during a recession, it's going to scare everyone and they're not going to invest, and it's going to, create a downward spiral. And this alliance between kind of Keynesian economists and the labor movement was responsible for that kind of, New Deal politics in the US, what we call the kind of post-war consensus in the UK. And it really embedded this idea that the left was about getting this government to do things, and the right was the opposite of that, particularly when the neoliberals started to critique this model. And it was also helped, of course, by the Cold War, that context in which you had a capitalist economy and a socialist economy that you could counterpose. And we never really questioned and critiqued that. And the problem is that it's not really an accurate description of how capitalism works, because capitalism, as we've said, relies on on cooperation between states and big monopolies. And people know that. People are very aware of the fact that governments are often pretty corrupt, that they're in bed with powerful vested interests across the private sector, that politicians are much more likely to listen to people with money than they are ordinary voters. And when we went to people with this offer of give us your vote, the government will protect you and do nice things for you, people were kind of like, yeah, right. Like every politician I've ever known throughout my entire life has told me that. And most of the time, things haven't gone better. Now, this is actually this realization kind of led me into what is going to be my next book, because I basically think that the political emotion that is defining modern politics is this sense of powerlessness. So most people have problems in their lives that they know have something to do with the way our economy is organized. They don't have high enough wages. They can't afford to pay their rent, their bills. Maybe they can't get a job. whatever. And they also have some sort of sense that like what is going on in wider society isn't good, that there are challenges that we all collectively face. But because we have this like highly individualized way of organizing things, you basically confront those problems as an isolated individual. We don't have the labor movement that we had in the past. We don't have strong social movements linked to political parties that we had in the past. And as a result of that, it's just like you sitting there in your bubble thinking, everything's going wrong in my life and the world, but I'm only one person. What could I do to change that? I think that creates a deep sense of powerlessness, which basically the far right has exploited. It's basically said, everyone out there, the politicians, anyone who has a position of power and authority is part of this global conspiracy to keep you down by importing migrants and, pushing the trans agenda or whatever. And it provides this really convenient explanation as to why you feel so powerless. And the left has kind of responded to that by being like, well, actually, no, the government is nice and does nice things for you. But what we should have been saying was, throughout history, people like you have come together with other people like you to take on the vested interests that are making your life worse, to actually realize your collective power. You've organized in unions to demand higher wages. And if you haven't got that, you've gone on strike. You have organized in your communities and demanded certain things from your local government. You've organized yourself into political movements that have made massive changes. But because today we're all separated from one another and we feel that separation, we feel that loneliness and isolation as well as another big political problem, that's why you feel powerless. And the only way to move beyond that is to get people to organize, is to actually start fomenting that kind of real world politics that allows people to feel what it's like to resist. And I kind of really firmly believe that unless we're able to offer that on the left, the far right is the only option for people who are really pissed off at the status quo.
Grace,
so, yeah.
I think you're like totally right on this. I mean, I'll say, Texas Monthly, one of the big magazines here, did a really great piece a couple years back where they went and they interviewed non-voters, right? And the way non-voters are always sort of portrayed as like, oh, they're so distracted by the television.
Yeah.
And they just, they're just not engaged in the real world. They went and they talked to folks, and like, yeah, of course there was like some stuff where like people didn't map perfectly on the political compass, but also, the American political compass doesn't really make a lot of sense either, frankly, in terms of like working class politics. But more importantly, all these people actually like had a fairly good understanding of the world. But not only did they feel powerless, as you're saying, Grace, like a lot of them had believed and been burnt. Right. So a lot of people were like, oh, I, supported Obama in 2008. I thought my life was going to get better. My life got worse. And this is something that I think is not only, it's something that the left needs to be really serious about how to take this on. Because it's also very true. Sorry, I'm being very Texas centric here, but like that the right is taking advantage of it. Like the border part of Texas, right, which has traditionally been the Democrat stronghold here, swung pretty far to Trump. And these are like Mexican Americans, right, voting for Donald Trump. And a big part of it when they went and they did conversation with people is like, well, I've been supporting the Democrats my whole life, and nothing's particularly good has happened in it. So like, let's see what happens if we do this kind of thing. So I think you're totally right on this powerlessness thing. And it's abundantly clear that the right has been fairly equipped at taking advantage of this situation.
Yeah, it's that combination of, as you say, like that declining trust. Because I think you're right. When you've taken the time to go out and vote for someone, you've kind of already invested a little bit of like emotional energy in thinking, what will my life be like if this person gets elected? And when you keep like seeing that collapse, it's almost like getting your heart broken over and over again. And eventually you're just like, well, screw it. I can't be bothered anymore because it's, nothing good can come of this. And that then, creates this kind of nihilism of, well, nothing's going to change through politics. I can't change anything in my life. So what can we do? Well, there is this big, powerful leader who is telling me that he can kind of exercise strength on my behalf. I think that's what's really appealing about a guy like Trump, It's like you feel weak and powerless, but there's this big, strong billionaire who's going to go out there and be like, I'm a tough guy. And you can be like, that's my guy. Now I feel tough. I feel like I've got some power. And I think the only antidote to that is actually giving people a sense of what it really feels like to exercise power, i.e. through a movement that's making change in your community.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the Lucas plan, but one thing I've appreciated about old interview you did in Catalyst was there's two contradictory balance we need to sort of strike here, which is being clear-eyed about, say, what the government is and the system we live under, but also optimism. Like, socialists have a duty to communicate optimism, because I frankly am tired of seeing "we're so cooked" in the chats. Like we're cooked now. We've been cooked. We're cooking. But can you just talk about that balance a little bit?
Oh my God, yes. So this is my guy, Tony Benn. And his answer to this question was, there is no final victory, just as there is no final defeat, just the same battle to be fought over and over again. And that kind of sounds maybe less optimistic, but it is. It's a real sense of like, we are part of this long struggle, and there are big ups and there are big downs. But if you take a step back and look at the things that social movements, labor unions, organized groups of people have achieved throughout history in a context arguably more scary than this. Imagine how terrifying it would have been to live through the Great Depression, literally not be able to afford to eat, lose your job, see people jumping out windows, and then go into the Second World War, where, vast swathes of your friendship groups would have been killed somewhere far away, and the rest would have come back completely changed forever. And it was in that context that working people came together across many different societies and basically said, we've had enough of an economic model that works for the rich and not for everyone else. We have, fought and struggled and suffered, and we want what's ours. And they were able to do that because they got organized and made those demands. So we exist in this very, very long struggle, and it's easy to look at where we are now and think it's unprecedentedly bad, but it's not. It's been bad for workers ever since the origins of capitalism itself. Think about the kids working in the factories in like the 1850s in industrializing England. Like, capitalism creates this kind of suffering, but it has also always created resistance to that suffering. It has always created or given rise to movements of people that have come together and said, we're not putting up with this anymore. And at the moment we start saying there's too much suffering, or the forces aligned against us are too powerful, we couldn't possibly even try to come together in the way we have in the past. That's when we're cooked. It's when we start saying we're so cooked that we can't do anything, that we actually are cooked. So like, stop bringing this world into being by saying that everything's going wrong. Like, this is, at the end of Vulture Capitalism, I have these 10 case studies of what I call examples of kind of democratic planning. So basically the argument is we live in this kind of oligarchic system of capitalist planning. What would it look like if we had a kind of democratic form of planning where communities, workers came together and said, this is how we want society to be organized? And then you say, oh, well, that's super utopian. And I say, well, here's 10 examples of people who've done that, from the Lucas Plan to the community wealth building movement to the participatory budgeting movement, things that have been happening all over the world. And the book I'm working on now about these questions of kind of individualism and powerlessness is just going to be mainly composed of examples of people from lots of different countries and lots of different places who are right now building movements to resist water privatization, to create cooperative communities for housing, to organize their workplaces, to provide care for people in their communities. Like, all of these incredible things that are happening right now, some of which are translating into political movements, some of which aren't, but which possibly will in the future. So it's like and I've been shocked, like, just reaching out to a few of the people I know across the left around the world, being like, what's going on in your place? They're like, well, things suck, but also this, and this is happening. And I'm like, wow, we don't hear about this. We don't talk about the cool things that are going on. Why not?
Yeah, I mean, just two things I'll name. The American Federation of Teachers, I believe, joined UAW's intention to strike on May Day in about 4 years. That's something that would have excited us so much if we heard like 10 years ago. So yeah.
Yeah.
There's a couple things. We don't have time, but there's a good section in your book where you talk about the limitations of Keynes and Hayek, the framing of economic debate, which was the dominant one that I certainly came into learning about economics on. And you generally sort of shuffled over to Team Keynes if you're on the left, and it's like maybe there's some more to this than these two guys. But can you just outline the Lucas plan for folks? You go into it more deeply into your book.
Yeah, so another thing which Tony Benn was involved in. If you guys don't know him in the US, you should look him up. So the Lucas plan was basically, there was an aerospace company in the UK called Lucas Aerospace, and it was threatened by rising competition from abroad. The workers at the factory were worried that the firm was going to go under. So they approached Tony Benn, who was then a minister in the Labour government, and said, can you nationalise us? And Ben said, we don't think we can do that, but why don't you guys go away and think up a plan as to how you could kind of reorganize the company, and then we'll see what we can do working with you from there. They did that. They went away and they asked the workers at Lucas Aerospace, what do you think we should do with the company? And the response they got was like astonishing. These were just ordinary workers from all over the country, and they were like, we don't want to produce weapons anymore. We want to produce socially useful technologies. These are the things that we work with every day. These are the resources that we have. These are how they can be used to produce wind turbines, produce kidney dialysis machines, produce health tech, whatever. And the union leaders put all these ideas together in a document, and worked with people within the organization to come up with a transition plan, to think about how this could be a worker-owned company, like a number of worker-owned companies that exist all around the world today. And they produced this crazy radical document that was basically like, took aim at the kind of fundamental thing that makes capitalism, which is the divide between workers and owners. Now, we never really got to see what would happen with this, because not long after the Lucas Plan was published, Margaret Thatcher, our Reagan, got into power. And she was all about freedom, right? They were about free markets, individual freedom, allowing everyone to kind of pursue their best sense of what their best life is. But when it came to the workers at Lucas Aerospace exercising their freedom, that was a step too far. The union leaders were basically removed for spending too much time on union businesses. They were crushed as part of this broader attack on the labour movement that Thatcher imposed when she came into power. And for a while, the people who've been involved in it tried to get projects started in other places. So they went to London, worked with the GLC, the Greater London Council, to create people's technology networks, which were about bringing together small businesses with local governments and workers to kind of see what the technology needs of different communities were, and then put those into practice. Thatcher then shut down the GLC. So this movement for democratic planning was fundamentally threatening to the interests of capital, not only because it was about pulling power down from the top, but also because it threatened their narrative. Their narrative was like, we are giving you freedom. That's our thing. So when workers decided to take that freedom and use it in ways that those at the top didn't like, they couldn't have that. It undermined this distinction that they built up in their heads, which is the left is about control, the right is about freedom. And I start my book actually with another example of an aerospace company, Boeing, which many of you may have heard of, basically which knowingly produced planes that fell out the sky, killing several hundred people. Lucas Aerospace was chopped up in the shareholder value revolution of the 1980s, and part of what was once Lucas Aerospace was bought by a company that produced the faulty sensors for the Boeing planes that caused them to crash, killing all those people. And I'm basically like, those are the two paths we have, like democratic, socially useful technology for public good, or a powerful monopoly that produces planes that fall out of the sky. Those are the two options for economic models, not big state, small state, not free markets, centralized planning. It's like democratic people power or corporate control.
It's a fascinating sort of glimpse into a different future, because It's one that I think could be very persuasive to anybody who's worked at these corporations. Is do you think, like, I'm thinking about Boeing, Alphabet, Facebook, Intel, these companies that have like basically bloated themselves out of being competitive. I think probably the workers and the engineers and stuff at those corporations, if they were empowered, maybe we'd be, doing smarter things than VR characters on Facebook that don't have
100%.
legs or something.
I had a friend who worked in tech, and I won't say where, but they had, they're very smart and they had an interesting job, and basically one of their projects was like how to get Domino's to keep up with your conversation so that it could ping you with an alert to order Domino's, right?
Oh my god!
And you just talk about like what your life is like. I mean, it's a kind of miserable use of your energies and intellect.
Yeah.
All this insane technology.
Yeah, that's what our intelligent people are doing when they could be thinking about how we tackle climate breakdown or just like building useful things. It's crazy.
I mean, the AI stuff is driving me crazy because, again, like I think there might be some useful things, but the applications that I'm seeing pitched as revolutionary are you'll be able to have them book vacations for you online. So it's going to be able to use Expedia for you 1,000 times better than you could as a human. Like, okay, I can't wait for that. Grace Blakeley, Vulture Capitalism is the most recent book. Is there anything else people should be looking out for you? I mean, I'm anxious to read that next book.
Yeah, so the next book won't be out for a while, but in the meantime, I've set up a Substack where I am basically going to be highlighting different examples of kind of grassroots struggles for economic justice from all around the world, and it's called What Can We Do? wcwd.substack.com.
Very good. We'll include the link to that. Thank you so much, Grace.
Thanks, guys.